"Can you fix this?" the quiet girl whispered as Warren Pike crushed one half of her oil-stained drawing toward the trash. Daniel Mercer slid from beneath the rattling sedan, killed the engine, and caught the paper before it fell. He knelt beside Lucy, fitted the torn edges together over his steel toolbox, and exposed a circle marked by 3 tiny strokes. Claire Whitmore stepped through the garage door, saw the symbol, and dropped her phone. "That design belongs to my company," she said. 3 hours earlier, the fluorescent lights inside Pike Community Auto and Repair had been humming half a note lower than usual. Dan noticed because he noticed sounds other people learned to ignore. The dry scrape of a worn bearing, the uneven breath of an air compressor, the small stutter inside an engine before metal began breaking metal. He was 42, tired in the shoulders, and halfway beneath a rusted sedan when the motor gave 3 soft knocks beneath the louder clatter. He raised one hand. "Shut it down." Warren, wearing his cleanest work shirt for a scheduled community tour photo, smiled without warmth. "It's a loose shield, Dan. Finish the job." The third knock came sharper. Dan reached the cut-off switch himself. The engine died, leaving the garage full of fluorescent buzz and the smell of hot oil. A second later, Lucy Whitmore appeared near the parts counter. She was 10, slight, and almost hidden behind oversized noise-canceling headphones. In both hands she carried 2 torn sheets covered in pencil lines, careful arrows, and a yellow circle drawn around one narrow channel. Warren saw her before Dan did. His public smile returned. "Sweetheart, customers can't be back here." Lucy stopped. She looked toward the woman entering behind her, but Claire was answering a call near the glass door and had not yet seen the papers. "I only need someone to look," Lucy said. "My model keeps stopping." Warren took the top sheet between 2 fingers as if it were dirty. "This is a working garage, not a schoolcraft table." He crumpled the corner. Lucy's fingers tightened around the second half. Dan pushed himself upright. "Give it back." Warren glanced at the clients near the waiting area, then softened his voice into the patient tone he used when cameras were present. "I'm keeping a child away from equipment. That is called being responsible." He tossed one piece toward the open drum where oily shop rags were stored. Dan moved before it landed. He caught it against his chest, leaving a black smear across the faded flannel beneath his coveralls. Warren's smile thinned. "You stop paid work again. I deduct it." Dan looked at Lucy, not at him. "Did you want him to throw this away?" She shook her head. He set the paper on the scarred wooden bench and wiped it with the last clean shop towel from his pocket. Only then did he wipe his own fingers against his pant leg. "Then it stays with you." Lucy stepped closer. One hinge of her headphones hung loose, but she kept them pressed over her ears as the compressor kicked on again. Dan turned the steel toolbox sideways to hold the page flat against the fan's draft. The lid bore a shallow, hand-cut circle crossed by 3 short marks, dulled by 20 years of scratches. Lucy noticed it first. "That looks like mine." Dan's hand stopped on the torn edge. The drawing showed a heat transfer assembly, crude in places, but the narrow return channel was drawn with a correction he had once made alone, late at night before Noah was born. Near the burned corner, 2 numbers remained visible. The rest had been torn away. Warren reached for the page. "That isn't hers." Dan covered it with one palm. "Nobody asked who owns it." Behind them, Claire ended her call. Her heels clicked once, twice, then stopped. She was staring at the circle on the page, then at the same mark carved into Dan's toolbox. "Lucy," she said carefully, "where did you get that?" Lucy looked from her mother to Dan, Dad's old box. The garage seemed to contract around those 3 words. Claire's face did not soften with belief. It tightened with recognition and fear. Warren stepped between her and the bench, still wearing the expression of a helpful employer. "Mrs. Whitmore, this man has a history of making claims. I can handle this." Dan's eyes lifted. He had never told Warren Claire's name. Then Warren added, too quickly, "And that B-17. Revision mark is company property." Dan said nothing. Neither had Claire. The code B-17 was not written anywhere on the visible page. Dan kept his palm over the drawing. Say that again. The B-17 revision mark, Warren replied. Company property. How do you know that code? The fluorescent lights buzzed above them, and somewhere near Bay 3, cooling metal clicked inside the sedan Dan had shut down. Claire looked from Warren's clean collar to Dan's oil-blackened hand, then to the scorched corner of the drawing trapped beneath his palm. Warren gave a small, practiced laugh. Mrs. Whitmore, I manage a repair facility that services corporate equipment. Codes pass through here. He turned slightly so his body blocked Lucy from the bench. What matters is keeping proprietary material away from someone with a documented history of making ownership claims. Lucy tried to speak. I found it in. Your mother will handle it, Warren said gently. Adults need to sort out adult things. Lucy lowered her eyes. Dan slid the drawing closer to her, not to Claire. She was answering a question. Warren's smile remained, but his jaw tightened. 2 customers in the waiting area had gone quiet. One of them glanced at the name patch on Dan's coveralls, then whispered something to the man beside him. Both looked at Dan's steel toolbox and then away, as if recognizing poverty were the same as recognizing guilt. Warren stepped toward the time clock. You stopped a paid repair without authorization, entered the hazardous waste area, and interfered with a customer's child. I have procedures. You threw her paper into oil. I removed debris from a restricted workspace. The wall clock ticked above a row of faded safety certificates. Warren uncapped a red marker and wrote deduction beside Dan's name on the weekly board, pressing hard enough that the tip squeaked. Noah came through the side door carrying a dented lunch tin and stopped when he saw the small crowd. He was 13, tall enough to look older from a distance and young enough for embarrassment to show before he could hide it. Dad! Dan turned. The tightness around his eyes softened for half a second. You made it. Noah held out the tin. You forgot lunch. A customer near the vending machine smirked. That him? The boy whose dad thinks every knocking engine is a stolen invention. The other man laughed under his breath. Noah's fingers tightened around the handle until his knuckles paled. He did not look at Dan. Warren lifted one hand as though calming everyone. Let's not make this personal. Daniel has had a difficult few years. I gave him work when other shops had concerns. Dan took the lunch tin from Noah. It was still warm on one side. Thank you. Noah stared at the floor. I should go. Dan did not ask him to stay. He did not ask him to defend anything. He only straightened the bent latch on the tin with his thumb and said, Watch for traffic at the corner. Noah nodded once and left through the side door. The bell above it gave a thin metallic shake. Claire watched Dan's face after the door closed. He did not follow his son. He did not explain. He set the lunch on the workbench beside Lucy's broken headphones and returned to the paper. Warren pulled a form from a clipboard. Sign here. Work interruption and misconduct. Dan read it slowly. The page blamed him for delaying the sedan repair and listed Lucy as the cause of an unauthorized disturbance. He took Warren's pen, drew one line through the child's name, and initialed the change. Put the hours on me. She entered the bay. She asked for help. Rules do not change because a child is quiet. Dan placed the pen down carefully. Then write a better rule. Claire's gaze shifted to Lucy. The girl stood with her shoulders drawn inward, one hand gripping the loose hinge of her headphones. Claire still did not know whether Dan's story, whatever it was, could be trusted. But she had watched him accept lost wages rather than let a 10-year-old be entered into an incident report. Warren reached for the drawing again. Mrs. Whitmore, I strongly recommend you leave before Mercer turns this into another accusation. Claire's phone vibrated against the concrete floor where it had fallen. Victor Hale's name glowed across the cracked screen. She answered. Victor. His voice came through clear enough for Dan to hear in the silence. Get Lucy away from Mercer before he turns this into another claim. Claire looked up slowly. I never told you Mercer was here. Warren stopped moving. The red marker remained uncapped in his hand. Claire glanced at the recent call list on her phone, then toward Warren's cell beside the time clock. 3 minutes before she had entered the garage, Warren Pike had called Victor Hale. Claire kept her phone at her side. "Why did Warren call you?" "Because Pike services our equipment," Victor said. He knows how quickly Mercer turns confusion into accusation. Dan heard every word, but he did not look up. Lucy's broken headphones were still lying beside the oil-stained blueprint, one hinge hanging by a thin strip of plastic. The garage smelled of hot rubber and solvent. Warren capped the red marker and returned his professional smile. "Mrs. Whitmore, this is exactly why I tried to keep things orderly." Claire's eyes stayed on him. "You called Victor before I arrived. I recognized a sensitive document. You called before you saw the document." For one moment, only the air compressor filled the space. Then Lucy pressed both palms over her ears as the machine shuddered into another cycle.
Done, Noti Chet.
He slid the steel toolbox away from the blueprint, opened the shallow upper tray, and took out a narrow screwdriver, 2 washers, and a piece of black heat shrink tubing. "May I see those?" he asked. Lucy lowered the headphones carefully. "They pinch now. I won't change anything you don't want changed." She handed them over. Warren glanced at the wall clock. "Your lunch break started 6 minutes ago, Mercer." Dan sat on the edge of the scarred workbench and examined the broken hinge beneath the fluorescent light. The plastic had split around a small metal pin. He could have wrapped it with tape in 10 seconds. Instead, he filed a washer until it fit inside the joint, warmed the tubing with a low heat gun, and rebuilt the hinge so the pressure would spread across the frame instead of returning to the same weak point. Lucy watched his hands. Claire watched the way he explained each step before touching the next piece. Victor was still speaking through the phone. "Claire, leave the paper with Pike. Legal can collect it." Dan tested the hinge once, then placed the headphones on the bench instead of directly on Lucy's head. "Try them yourself." She did. Her shoulders dropped when the garage noise softened. "Better. It doesn't hurt." Dan nodded and turned back to the blueprint. He did not ask Claire what company she ran. He did not ask Victor why he knew his name. He did not ask what the drawing might be worth. Lucy pointed to the pencil lines. "The little model stops after the third sound." "Show me." She took a shoebox from beneath the waiting room chair. Inside sat a child-sized mechanical assembly made from cardboard, copper wire, a toy motor, and 2 plastic gears. One side had been marked with her yellow pencil. Dan carried it to the far end of the workbench away from the blueprint. "We can test it once." Warren folded his arms. "Not with shop materials." Dan looked into the scrap bin. These were discarded. They still belonged to the business. Dan reached into his pocket and counted out $11 in wrinkled bills. It was the money he had set aside for dinner and gas until Friday. He placed it on the counter. Warren looked at the bills, then at Dan's lunch tin. "All that for a school project?" Dan selected a small motor, a length of wire, and 1 brass gear. "For a question." The side door opened. Noah stood there again, breathing hard from running back. "Dad, you left your rent envelope in the truck." He held up a plain white envelope with Mercer written across the front. Dan crossed the floor, took it, and checked the seal. "Thanks." Noah looked at the money on the counter, then at the untouched lunch tin. "Are you eating?" Dan handed him the tin. "You are. But Mom packed those sandwiches the way you like." The words slipped out before Noah could stop them. His mother had been gone long enough that he usually said nothing when memory reached into a room. Dan's hand paused on the bent latch. "Then you'll know they're good." Noah did not argue. He tucked the tin against his chest and looked at Lucy's repaired headphones. "You fixed those too?" "Just the hinge." Noah nodded, disappointed and proud at the same time, then left. Dan returned to the model. He replaced the toy motor, aligned the gear, and let Lucy connect the final wire herself. The assembly hummed. 1 beat, 2, 3. Then the brass gear trembled against the cardboard housing. Dan cut the power before the wire could heat. "Did I build it wrong?" Lucy asked. No, he touched the narrow return channel she had circled in yellow. "You noticed something was wrong. That matters." Claire stepped closer. "What did she notice?" Dan tilted the model so the overhead light caught the pencil marks. This channel sends heat back where it came from. Someone copied the shape but removed the part that lets it escape. Warren gave a soft laugh. He can make a conspiracy out of a shoebox. While he spoke, he lifted his phone and angled it toward the blueprint. The glass door of the locked parts cabinet reflected the screen clearly. A photograph appeared. Then a message window labeled VH. Claire saw it. Dan did not. He was still studying the model's 3-beat vibration, one finger resting beside Lucy's yellow circle. "Don't make it run longer," he said. "Not until we know who changed this." Claire looked from the reflected message to the erased safety channel on Lucy's drawing. For the first time, Dan's small act of kindness did not look separate from the mystery. It looked like the first reliable test of the truth. Claire did not look away from the reflection in the parts cabinet glass. Warren's phone was still raised toward the blueprint. The message window marked VH fading as his thumb moved across the screen. "Put it down," she said. Warren lowered the phone with a puzzled smile. "I was documenting company property. You called Victor before you knew what the paper was. I recognized the type of work." Dan disconnected Lucy's model and laid the warm copper wire on the bench to cool. He had heard the change in Claire's voice, but he kept his attention on the small machine. Kindness had made him useful to Lucy. Now it made him look like a mechanic who had altered possible evidence before anyone qualified could examine it. Warren stepped closer to Claire. He replaced components, handled the document, and told a child someone sabotaged her project. Whatever was on that paper before, we can no longer prove he did not add it. Claire's eyes shifted to Dan's hands. Oil darkened the lines of his fingers. A yellow pencil rested beside the channel he had identified. Warren's explanation was unfair, but it was not impossible. Dan had touched nearly everything. "Did you draw on the blueprint?" Claire asked. "No. Did you know the symbol was there before today?" Dan looked at the shallow mark cut into his steel toolbox. "I knew a symbol like it." "That is not the same answer." "No," he said. "It isn't." The garage fan pushed cold air across the workbench, lifting one torn corner of the paper. Dan placed 2 clean metal sockets on the edges instead of using his hands again. Lucy stood beside him with her repaired headphones around her neck. "The yellow circle was already there," she said. Claire crouched until they were eye level. "Are you certain?" Lucy nodded. "I drew it because that part got hot. And the 3 little lines? Those were there when I found it." Warren folded his arms. "A 10-year-old's memory is not chain of custody." His tone stayed soft, almost protective, as though dismissing Lucy were a kindness. Claire stood again. "Neither is your photograph." Warren's smile held, but one finger tapped twice against the side of his phone. Dan looked at the blueprint under the fluorescent strip. The light was too diffuse. "May I move the lamp?" Claire hesitated, then nodded. He pulled the adjustable inspection light down until it skimmed across the paper instead of shining directly onto it. The surface changed. Pencil grooves appeared where graphite had been erased, and beneath the oil stain, a row of faint numbers emerged beside the burned corner. Noah, who had returned quietly and now stood near the side door with the empty lunch tin, leaned forward. "That's my birthday." Claire turned. "How can you tell?" "The month and day. Dad uses the same numbers for everything he shouldn't." Dan gave his son a tired look. "Not everything." Noah almost smiled, then remembered the room. Claire studied the marks again. "A family date does not prove authorship." "It shouldn't," Dan said. He pulled a blank work order from the counter and wrote 3 lines. "Copied later, added by someone else, damaged file." He placed the paper beside the blueprint. "Those are reasons I could be wrong." Warren stared at him. "You expect us to believe you are arguing against yourself?" "I expect the paper to survive questions." Claire's expression changed by less than an inch, but her hand loosened around her phone. She opened the Whitmore Patent Archive and searched B17. The official design appeared in clean blue lines. The overall structure matched Lucy's paper, but the 3-stroke circle was gone. So was the narrow safety channel Lucy had colored yellow. A gray warning banner slid across the screen. Legacy draft files scheduled for automatic deletion in 48 hours. Claire immediately selected Preserve. Access restricted appeared in red. Legal hold required, she said. Victor controls legacy access, Warren replied too quickly. Claire looked at him. I did not say who controlled it. The side door opened, and Victor Hale entered in a charcoal coat carrying the calm expression of a man arriving to resolve someone else's misunderstanding. He greeted Lucy first, asked whether she was all right, then turned to Dan with measured concern. Mr. Mercer, I understand you found an old technical sketch. Dan did not correct the word found. Claire angled the tablet toward Victor but kept the screen partially covered with her hand. Do you recognize the mark? Victor barely glanced at the blueprint. It is an abandoned B-17 revision mark. Nothing more. The garage went still. Claire slowly lowered her hand from the tablet. The visible file contained no revision code. Lucy's paper contained no letters or numbers beside the symbol. Dan closed his toolbox with a quiet metal click. Years earlier, only 4 people had ever heard that internal name. One was dead. One was Dan. And Victor had just spoken it before anyone showed him where it was hidden. Victor's words remained in the garage like the smell of overheated wiring. An abandoned B-17 revision mark, he repeated, more slowly this time. That code was never shown to you, Claire said. It did not need to be. Then let him prove he understands it. Victor's expression stayed composed, almost generous, as though he were offering Dan a fair chance instead of building a trap. He explained that Whitmore Dynamics had a prototype scheduled for a school district demonstration that afternoon. If Dan truly recognized the design, Victor said, he could examine the machine under controlled conditions and identify the supposed flaw without touching the archived files. Dan looked at Lucy's model, then at the red deletion notice still glowing on Claire's tablet. Are children going to be near it? Observers, Victor said. Behind safety glass. That wasn't my question. 2 hours later, the Whitmore Dynamics test floor smelled of cold steel, electrical insulation, and coffee left too long on a warming plate. White lights reflected from polished concrete. Engineers in clean gray jackets stood behind a yellow line while Dan entered in the same faded blue coveralls he had worn at the garage, carrying only his old steel toolbox. Victor introduced him as an outside mechanic brought in to evaluate a noise complaint. No one laughed openly, but one engineer moved a laptop away as Dan passed, and another glanced at the oil beneath his fingernails. Claire stood near the observation window with Lucy and Noah safely behind the glass. Lucy wore the headphones Dan had repaired. Noah kept both hands in his pockets. The prototype sat on a raised platform, its outer shell newly painted white. Dan walked around it once without touching the controls. You may begin, Victor said. Has it been run today? Standard warm-up cycle. Who cleared the service warnings? Victor's smile did not change. You are here to inspect the equipment, not our personnel. Dan crouched beside the lower housing. The cooling fan produced a soft mechanical hum, but beneath it came the same uneven rhythm Lucy's model had made. 1 beat, 2, 3, then a pause too short to be normal. Dan took a quarter from his pocket and placed it upright on the metal casing. Victor glanced toward the engineers. A coin trick. A vibration check. We have calibrated instruments. Then they can tell us if I'm wrong. The machine began its demonstration cycle. The quarter trembled, settled, then walked sideways by the width of its ridged edge. 1 beat, 2, 3. Done stop. Shut it down. Victor did not move. The readings are within tolerance. Shut it down. Mr. Mercer, this is not a garage. The quarter tipped over and spun in a tight silver circle. Dan saw a young technician step toward the pressure housing to adjust a sensor. He crossed the yellow line, caught the technician by the sleeve, and pulled him back 2 steps. Now, Claire's hand came down on the emergency cutoff. The motor died. 3 seconds later, a seam beside the lower heat channel split with a sharp metallic crack. White vapor struck the clear safety shield where the technician's wrist had been. The room lost every small sound except the ventilation system. A rolling chair stopped halfway across the floor. One engineer slowly lowered a coffee cup without drinking. Dan wrapped a damp shop cloth around the technician's reddened wrist and asked him to move his fingers. "I'm okay," the young man whispered. "Dan nodded. "Keep it under cool water anyway." He did not look at Victor. He did not say he had warned them. Claire ordered the platform sealed and the security footage preserved. She asked for the original service log, the warm-up records, and 3 independent engineers to repeat the vibration test. Victor stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Claire, let me handle this privately. A public shutdown will create unnecessary alarm. A pressure seam just failed. Because a mechanic interfered with the cycle." Dan picked up the fallen quarter and set it beside the crack. Beneath the fresh white paint, a stamped code had been exposed where the metal separated. B17. Claire's assistant opened the maintenance system. 2 earlier vibration alerts appeared in gray. Each changed from critical to resolved without a repair entry. The account that approved both changes belonged to a senior administrator, but the name field was locked. Victor's hand flattened against the edge of the console. "The commercial version always runs hotter," he said. The independent engineer beside him stopped typing. Claire turned her head. "No one said this was the commercial version." Victor's fingers lifted from the console. Dan knelt near the broken housing and ran one finger along a narrow groove hidden beneath the fractured panel. The metal had been machined according to his original safety correction, but the insert had been mounted backward, forcing heat toward the pressure seam instead of away from it. That was not wear. It was not a copied mistake. Someone inside Whitmore Dynamics had known exactly where the correction belonged, and had reversed it before the machine reached the school demonstration. Dan kept his finger beside the reversed safety insert. "This wasn't installed wrong by accident." "You cannot know that," Victor said. "The groove is directional. Then let engineering review it." The test floor remained silent around them. White vapor clung to the safety shield, and the fallen quarter reflected the red emergency lights, while Claire's assistant sealed the service log Dan had forced into view. 2 vibration warnings had been marked resolved without repair records. Now the backward insert connected those altered entries to a physical change someone inside Whitmore Dynamics had understood well enough to conceal. Dan stood and looked through the observation glass. Noah was watching him differently, but not with pride yet. There was hurt in the boy's face, the kind created by realizing a parent had hidden more than poverty. Dan closed his steel toolbox. "There's something I should have shown you years ago." The storage facility sat beyond the old rail yard, where weeds pushed through cracked asphalt and the security light flickered even in daylight. Dan unlocked a narrow unit while Noah waited beside him with both hands buried in his jacket pockets. Claire stood several feet back, accompanied by an independent evidence technician rather than company counsel. Victor had demanded the search be stopped until Whitmore lawyers could supervise. Claire had refused. "Why here?" Noah asked. Dan lifted the corrugated door. Dust moved through the pale beam of light. "Your mother kept what I was too ashamed to look at." Inside were 3 plastic bins, a folded crib, and a cedar box that still carried the faint scent of the lavender sachets Dan's wife used in their closets. He did not touch the box immediately. Noah did. Beneath old birthday cards lay a photograph curled at the corners. Dan stood beside an unfinished B-17 prototype, younger and clean-shaven, one hand resting on the same steel toolbox. His wife stood beside him, visibly pregnant, smiling toward someone outside the frame. The circular mark with 3 strokes was already carved into the toolbox lid. A date stamped along the photograph's white border placed it 14 months before Victor's patent filing. Claire's breath slowed. "This establishes access and timeline," she said, "not authorship by itself." Dan nodded. "It shouldn't be enough by itself." On the back of the photograph, his wife had written a locker number and 4 digits matching the incomplete birth date on Lucy's blueprint. The locker was in a smaller compartment at the rear of the unit. Inside, they found a scorched recording box, a laboratory access receipt, 2 garage invoices, and a memory card wrapped in wax paper. The technician photographed every item before moving it. Metadata from the card showed an original design file created under Dan's employee account. A later version removed the safety channel and detached his electronic signature from the warning report. The garage invoices showed Warren had sold prototype components to a shell supplier later absorbed into a company controlled by Victor's brother-in-law. It was not one altered file. 5 safety reports had been edited in the same way. 3 technicians had been reassigned after refusing to close warnings. 1 had been blamed for damaging a pressure assembly identical to the one that failed that morning. Noah stared at the screen. Post it. No, they called you a liar. That doesn't make the internet a courtroom. Dan placed one hand over the memory card before Noah could reach for it. If we release half of this now, Victor says it was altered. Workers who had nothing to do with him lose their jobs, and the people who changed those logs get time to destroy what's left. Noah's jaw tightened. So we wait again? We verify. Then we speak once. The evidence technician connected the recording box to an isolated player. Static filled the unit, followed by Dan's younger voice warning that the commercial configuration would trap heat near the pressure seam. Another voice answered from farther away. Victor's. The audio cracked, then returned. Remove Mercer from the chain. Keep his correction off the filed version. The recording cut into harsh electronic noise. Claire's phone began vibrating. Victor's name appeared, then disappeared, then returned. When she answered, his voice had lost its polished calm. Do not play anything else. That device is company property. Claire looked at the scorched box between them. Our records say Dan was never assigned to be 17. Victor paused. He created material while working under Whitmore authority. Dan met Claire's eyes. Victor had just claimed ownership of work the company insisted Dan had never performed. The technician recovered another fragment beneath the static. Remove Mercer before the widow? Claire's face went still in the reflection of the dark monitor. Her late husband had been the only person whose death had made that word relevant. She ended Victor's call, ordered an immediate warning sent to every facility using the system, and postponed the pending expansion deal. Then the technician opened the garage invoice ledger and found the next scheduled B-17 unit. It was not going to another factory. It was already listed for installation at the Pike Community STEM event the following morning, where Victor planned to demonstrate it in front of children, reporters, and the entire town. By 8 the next morning, Pike Community Auto and Repair no longer looked like the place where Warren had thrown Lucy's drawing into an oil drum. Blue Whitmore Dynamics banners covered the stained cinder block walls. Folding chairs stood in straight rows between the service bays, and a white B-17 demonstration unit rested beneath a ribbon near a cluster of schoolchildren. Reporters checked microphones beside the alignment rack. Parents held paper cups of coffee. Every camera faced the platform Warren had built over the same scarred workbench where Dan had repaired the torn blueprint. Dan entered through the side door carrying his steel toolbox. His coveralls were clean but faded, and he looked as though he had not slept. Noah walked beside him. Lucy stood behind Claire near the front row, her repaired headphones resting around her neck and the original drawing held flat inside a clear evidence sleeve. Warren reached the microphone before Claire could speak. Yesterday, a former Whitmore contractor created unnecessary concern around a proven educational system. His voice was warm, measured, and heavy with disappointment rather than anger. Mr. Mercer has experienced personal hardship, and this community has tried to support him. But hardship does not excuse interrupting a children's program or making unsupported ownership claims. Several people turned toward Dan. One customer from the garage whispered to another. A camera lens tightened on the old toolbox in his hand. Victor stood beside the ribbon in a charcoal suit, one palm resting lightly on the demonstration unit as if calming an animal. We reviewed the incident, he said. The failed component was damaged during an unauthorized test. The sketch in question is an abandoned company draft that may have passed through several repair vendors. Similar markings prove access, not authorship. For a moment, the explanation seemed to settle over the room. It was clean, It accounted for the drawing, the garage receipts, and even Dan's knowledge without admitting theft. Warren released a slow breath. Victor gestured toward the children. We should not let one man's unresolved grievance take an opportunity away from them. Dan did not approach the microphone. He set his toolbox on the workbench and looked at the B-17 unit. Beneath the soft music playing from the event speakers, he heard it begin its idle cycle. 1 beat, 2, 3. Lucy heard it too. Her hand closed around Claire's fingers. That's the sound, she whispered. Victor lifted the ceremonial switch. Dan moved toward the platform. Security stepped in front of him. Please remain behind the line. Pull the fuse. The unit has been cleared. Pull it now. Warren raised his voice just enough for the microphones. This is the behavior we were warned about. Dan looked past him at the children standing beside the pressure housing. He did not argue. He stepped around the edge of the platform, reached beneath the control panel, and removed the main fuse before Victor could lower the switch. The indicator lights went dark. Gasps moved through the room. A security guard caught Dan by the wrist. Victor turned toward the cameras. You have all just witnessed deliberate sabotage of a charitable event. Dan did not resist the guard. Move the kids first. Claire gave the order. Teachers guided the children behind the glass office wall. Only when the last student was clear did Dan release his grip on the fuse. Claire walked to the workbench without looking at Victor. She placed Lucy's torn blueprint beside Dan's steel toolbox. The circle with 3 short marks aligned with the old carving on the lid. Then she set down the photograph from the storage unit, dated 14 months before the patent filing. A mark and a photograph still do not prove who designed the system, Victor said. Correct, Claire replied. She placed the failed B-17 insert beside them, its safety channel mounted backward. An independent engineer stepped forward and confirmed that 3 separate tests had reproduced the same dangerous vibration Dan identified with a quarter. Victor's face stayed composed. That establishes a manufacturing error. It does not establish theft. The room began to tilt back toward him. Then Claire's assistant dimmed the lights and projected the garage security footage onto the white bay door. In the reflection of the parts cabinet, Warren's phone could be seen photographing Lucy's drawing and sending it to a contact labeled VH. Warren's mouth opened. I was reporting proprietary material. Before anyone had identified it as proprietary, Claire said. The next image showed the garage invoice linking prototype components to Victor's shell supplier. Warren looked at Victor, expecting help. Victor stepped half a pace away from him. Pike handled vendor transactions. I did not manage his records. That was the moment Warren understood he had been chosen to carry the blame. He reached into his jacket and handed an original carbon copy invoice to the independent attorney near Claire. He told me to keep this off the digital ledger, Warren said. His voice had lost its public warmth. I kept the paper because I knew he'd say exactly what he just said. Victor's hand tightened around the ribbon scissors. A frightened subcontractor is not a credible witness. Dan finally faced him. This isn't about punishing you in front of children. His voice was quiet enough that the room leaned toward it. It's about making sure the truth isn't buried where they'll have to pay for it later. Claire's assistant brought up the restored access logs. They placed Victor inside the test room when Dan's original warning was recorded. Victor glanced toward the ceiling camera. The recording box lost power at 9:43. Anything after that timestamp is corrupted. The independent audio technician stopped beside the equipment case. Claire turned slowly. We never released the cutoff time. Victor's eyes moved once toward the exit. The technician placed the scorched recording box on the workbench between the torn blueprint and the reversed insert. The final segment has been recovered, he said. The voice print and timestamps are authenticated. He asked Claire whether she wanted to hear it privately before it was entered into the public record. Claire looked at Dan, then at Lucy, then at the cameras Victor had invited. Play it here, she said. Let everyone he lied to hear the whole sentence. The audio technician pressed one key. The room expected static. Instead, the first sound was the steady hum of a cooling fan, followed by Dan's younger voice, speaking with the calm precision of someone explaining a problem before it became an emergency. If the return channel is reversed, heat will migrate into the pressure seam. It will pass testing once. It will fail later. A chair creaked somewhere behind the reporters. No one moved. The recording continued. Another voice entered, unmistakably Victor's, sharper than the polished tone he wore in public. Remove Mercer from the chain. Keep his correction off the filed version. Once the widow signs the expansion, no one will reopen it. The last words emerged through a wash of damaged tape. The warning stays out. Then silence. Not electronic silence. Human silence. The projector fan became the loudest sound in the garage. A disposable coffee cup slipped from someone's fingers and rolled beneath the front row without anyone bending to retrieve it. Victor opened his mouth, closed it, then reached for the recording box. The independent attorney stepped between them first. Please don't touch the evidence. Victor stopped with his hand suspended in the air. Claire walked to the workbench one slow step at a time. She placed the restored recording beside Lucy's torn blueprint. Then she laid the photograph from the storage unit beside the blueprint. Next came the garage invoice linking prototype parts to the shell supplier. Beside that, the service log showing 2 vibration warnings changed from critical to resolved without repairs. Finally, her assistant projected the metadata from Dan's original design file onto the white bay door. The timeline stretched across the wall like a single unbroken thread. The photograph, the original file, the removed safety channel, the altered service logs, the shell company invoices, the recording, every piece stood on its own. Together they left no empty space for coincidence. Claire looked toward the independent engineer. Did your team verify the vibration test? 3 separate times. Did the reversed insert produce the same dangerous result? Yes. She turned toward the evidence technician. Was this recording authenticated? VoicePrint confirmed. Timestamp confirmed. Chain of custody confirmed. Claire faced the crowd. Did anyone here hear Daniel Mercer accuse Victor Hale before these records were recovered? No one answered. They did not need to. Dan had spent the entire morning asking for verification instead of belief. Victor straightened his jacket with hands that no longer obeyed him completely. This recording lacks context. Then provide it, Claire replied. The company owns employee work product. The independent attorney lifted one document from the table. Your own personnel records state Mr. Mercer never worked on Project B-17. Victor's eyes shifted. Toward the exit again. Administrative error. Then why did you claim ownership over his B-17 work 20 minutes ago? His answer never came. Warren lowered his head. The practiced confidence that had carried him through years of half-truths simply disappeared. Across the room, one of the younger engineers quietly removed his Whitmore visitor badge and placed it on the nearest table before stepping forward. I reported vibration instability 18 months ago, he said. My warning disappeared the next day. Another technician raised her hand. Mine too. Then another voice joined them. Mine was reassigned. The pattern Claire feared was no longer a theory. It was a system. She drew one slow breath before speaking, not as a grieving widow or embarrassed executive, but as the person responsible for what happened next. Whitmore Dynamics did not discover Daniel Mercer. Her voice carried through the garage without a microphone. It erased him. Then it erased the warning that could have protected our workers and our children. Nobody applauded. Nobody cheered. Even the reporters lowered their cameras for a moment. Lucy reached for the blueprint inside its evidence sleeve and held it against her chest. Noah looked at his father with tears gathering but not falling. Dan remained exactly where he had stood since the recording began. He neither celebrated nor looked at Victor. Instead, he picked up the fallen quarter from the demonstration platform and placed it quietly beside the cracked B-17 housing, as though finishing an explanation no one had wanted to hear until it became impossible to ignore. Claire turned toward him. Mr. Mercer, before we discuss compensation, patents, or settlements, tell me what justice looks like. Dan answered without raising his voice. Start by recalling every unsafe unit. Protect the engineers who told the truth. Restore every name that was erased. Then make sure no child has to get hurt before your rules decide to listen. Claire nodded once. Effective immediately, every B-17 system is suspended. Independent investigators will receive full access to our archives. Mr. Hale's system credentials are revoked pending criminal and regulatory review. Every altered safety report will be reopened, and every employee connected to those reports will be protected from retaliation. Security approached Victor not with force but with formal procedure. He surrendered his access badge after one long hesitation, avoiding every camera in the room. The silence finally broke with the soft electronic click of his badge being deactivated. Claire reached into a leather portfolio resting beside the workbench. She withdrew 2 documents and held them without opening either one. "Daniel," she said quietly, "after everything that was taken from you, there is one decision only you can make." The first document restored Daniel Mercer as the original designer of the B-17 safety system. The second transferred Pike Community Auto and Repair into an independent restitution trust after investigators froze Warren's assets and uncovered years of falsified invoices. Claire did not slide either paper toward Dan as if offering charity. She placed them beside his steel toolbox and waited. Around them, reporters packed their cables without speaking. Parents led children toward the parking lot. Victor left through the service entrance with counsel and investigators, his access badge sealed inside a clear evidence bag. Warren remained near the office door while an attorney explained that the garage would stay closed until every employee record and customer invoice had been reviewed. Dan read both documents slowly. "The patent correction goes forward," he said. "The ownership transfer doesn't." Claire studied him. "The property was purchased with money connected to your stolen work. Then it shouldn't become mine alone." He turned the second document over and wrote 3 words across the blank margin. Community Workshop Trust. Noah leaned closer. Dan continued beneath it. Independent board. Paid apprenticeships. Safety training. Free repair nights. Protection for whistleblowers. Claire's mouth softened, though her voice remained careful. "You could sell the building. I could. You could leave this town." Dan looked across the garage at the oil drum where Warren had thrown Lucy's blueprint. "Leaving doesn't teach the place anything." Warren heard him. His face tightened, but Dan did not turn the moment into punishment. "He answers for the invoices," Dan said to the attorney. "He repays what he took. He doesn't manage anyone here again." Warren swallowed. "And after that?" Dan finally looked at him. "After that, what you become is your work." There was no forgiveness in the sentence, but there was no cruelty either. Only a boundary strong enough to stand without anger. In the months that followed, every B-17 unit was recalled and rebuilt with the safety channel restored. 3 engineers received formal apologies and their records were corrected. Workers who had been reassigned for reporting hazards returned with back pay and independent protections. Victor was indicted on fraud, evidence tampering, and reckless endangerment charges. Claire opened Whitmore's archives to outside review and created a safety council whose members could not be removed by executives they investigated. The garage reopened in spring beneath a new sign, Mercer Community Workshop. Dan refused a private office. His workbench remained near the second bay, under the same adjustable lamp he had used to reveal the erased pencil marks. His blue coveralls still carried oil at the knees. His steel toolbox still had the circle with 3 short marks carved into its lid. But no one looked at it as evidence of failure anymore. Students touched the symbol before beginning their first projects, a quiet reminder that every design needed someone brave enough to ask where the heat would go. Noah joined the first apprenticeship class. On opening day, he stood beside the toolbox while a local reporter asked whether his father had always been a genius. Noah looked embarrassed, then smiled. "He was always my dad. I just didn't know that was the bigger thing." Dan heard him from across the bay. He lowered his head for a moment and pretended to inspect a socket so no one would see his eyes. Lucy attended every Saturday with Claire. She no longer carried the torn blueprint in a plastic sleeve. The restored original hung behind glass near the entrance, while Lucy kept a copy folded inside her notebook and continued improving. The small model Dan had helped her test. Before touching any machine, she asked permission. Before dismissing any warning, the adults listened. Claire and Dan did not call what grew between them a romance. Not at first. She brought coffee on early mornings and stayed to sweep metal filings from the floor. He taught her how to hear a failing bearing before an instrument detected it. Some evenings they sat on the loading dock after the children had gone home, speaking about grief without trying to repair it too quickly. Trust came the way Dan repaired Lucy's headphones. Gently, with permission, strengthening what had cracked without pretending the break had never happened. One quiet afternoon, Lucy placed her yellow pencil beside Dan's toolbox and asked, "Can you fix this?" The pencil was broken cleanly in half. Dan examined it, then handed both pieces back to her. "You can." He showed her how to fit a small wooden sleeve around the break. Noah held the glue. Claire steadied the pencil while Lucy pressed the pieces together. When they finished, no one spoke. Sunlight entered through the raised garage door and settled across the old toolbox, the repaired pencil, and 4 hands resting near one another on the workbench. It was not the silence of people shocked by the truth. It was the silence of people finally safe enough to understand it. Dan closed the toolbox with the same soft metal click that had once ended every accusation against him, and in that small sound lived the lesson the whole town had nearly missed. Dignity never needed to shout, and kindness was never wasted. Sometimes it simply waited in the dark until someone brave enough carried it into the light.